Emily woke up to the unfamiliar scent of expensive linen and the faint hum of the city far below. Her head was pounding, her mouth dry, her body wrapped tightly in a blanket that was far too soft to belong to her own bed. Panic surged through her chest as she cracked open her eyes and saw the towering glass windows, the luxurious curtains drawn halfway, the glint of a breathtaking city skyline outside. "Where am I?" she thought, her breath hitching, her fingers clutching the blanket tighter. She sat up abruptly, wincing as the room spun, and her heart leapt into her throat when she realized she was nearly naked underneath. Her cheeks burned with confusion, shame, fear. She scrambled to the edge of the massive bed, trembling as her bare feet touched the cool marble floor. She didn't remember how she got here, only fragmented flashes from the night before, the way her sister Sophia had begged her for a favor, the way Sophia had pushed a drink into her hand, the way the world had gone blurry around the edges. Before she could process anything more, the door swung open and a tall man entered. Emily froze, her breath caught painfully in her chest. He was impossibly handsome, his black suit impeccably tailored, his dark hair slightly tousled as if he had run his fingers through it moments before, his sharp jawline, piercing gray eyes, and the cold, calculated expression on his face made Emily's stomach twist into knots. He didn't say a word at first, only stood there in the doorway, his gaze sweeping over her like a blade. She felt exposed, vulnerable, trapped, as if he could see right through the blanket clutched around her trembling form. Finally, his lips curved into a slow, humorless smirk. "You can stop pretending now, Sophia," he said coolly, his voice a deep, velvety baritone. Emily's eyes widened, her mouth opening in protest, but no sound came out. "Sophia, he thinks I'm Sophia." Her heart pounded wildly as she shook her head frantically. "No, you don't understand," she rasped, her throat dry and tight. "I'm not Sophia, I'm Emily." His eyes narrowed slightly, the amusement flickering into something sharper, colder. He took a slow step forward, and Emily instinctively shrank back, clutching the blanket tighter, her entire body trembling. The room was suffocatingly silent, except for the sound of Emily's shaky breathing. She could feel the weight of his presence, the sheer power he carried with every step, and it terrified her. She had no idea who he was, but something deep inside her warned that this man was dangerous, that he was not someone you crossed, that he was the kind of man who got exactly what he wanted. He stopped just a few feet from her, his gaze boring into hers. "Don't play games with me," he murmured, his voice low, almost gentle, but edged with steel. "You came here of your own choice. Don't pretend you're innocent now." Emily's chest tightened painfully, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She didn't know how to explain the truth, how to make him believe her. She wanted to run, to hide, but her legs felt weak, her mind a fog of confusion and fear. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, trying to steady her breathing, trying not to break down. The man let out a slow breath, his eyes softening just a fraction as he watched her. Without a word, he slipped off his jacket, stepped forward, and draped it over her shoulders. Emily flinched, her breath catching in her throat, but he didn't touch her again. Instead, he took a step back, his expression unreadable, his voice softer now. "Get some rest," he murmured, turning toward the door. "We'll talk when you're ready." And just like that, he was gone, leaving Emily sitting alone, wrapped in his scent, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might shatter her chest. Emily sat frozen on the edge of the massive bed, long after the man had left the room. She clutched his expensive jacket tightly around her trembling shoulders, her mind spinning wildly. She tried to piece together what had happened, but everything felt like a blur. Last night, Sophia had come to her apartment in tears, pleading for Emily to help her just this once. Sophia had always been the beautiful, daring twin, the one who walked through life with confidence and charm, while Emily had been the quiet one, the girl who taught preschool and spent her nights reading novels under a blanket. But when Sophia had stood there in the doorway, mascara streaked down her cheeks, whispering about a deal gone wrong and needing Emily to cover for her, at a party just for a few hours, Emily's resolve had crumbled. She had let Sophia dress her, had let Sophia paint her lips a shade she'd never dared wear, had slipped into a silk dress that clung to her curves in a way she wasn't used to. She had felt awkward, out of place, like she was stepping into someone else's skin. And now, she realized bitterly, she had. Sophia had promised to meet her at the end of the night, but Emily only remembered the dazzling lights, the strangers' faces, the sharp tang of expensive champagne. She remembered her sister whispering, "Just smile and let him see you. That's all you have to do." She remembered feeling dizzy, lightheaded, like the ground was shifting under her feet. And then, nothing. A soft knock on the door startled her out of her thoughts. She tensed, her fingers tightening on the edge of the blanket, but it wasn't the man from before who entered. Instead, a woman in a sleek black uniform stepped in, carrying a tray with food. She set it gently on the side table, her gaze professional, but kind. "Mr. Drake asked me to bring you something to eat, Miss Sophia," the woman said quietly. Emily flinched. There it was again, the mistake, the name she hadn't earned. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know how to explain the truth without dragging Sophia's name into the mud. Once the woman left, Emily forced herself to stand, her legs shaky beneath her. She wandered to the window, staring out at the sweeping view of the city. Whoever this Alexander Drake was, he was clearly wealthy beyond imagination. His penthouse towered high above the skyline, sleek and cold and perfect, much like the man himself. Emily hugged herself, feeling small, overwhelmed, completely out of her depth. She wondered if Sophia had known what she was asking her to step into, or if she had simply been desperate to run from her own troubles. As the hours passed, Emily paced the room, her nerves fraying with each passing minute. She jumped when the door opened again, her heart leaping into her throat. Alexander Drake stood there, his tall frame leaning casually against the doorframe, his sharp eyes never leaving her face. "Feeling better?" he asked, his tone deceptively light. Emily swallowed hard, nodding faintly, though her voice shook when she spoke. I need to go home." Alexander's brow lifted slightly, his mouth curving into something between amusement and curiosity. "Home?" he echoed, pushing off the doorframe and stepping inside. Emily's breath hitched as he crossed the room, closing the distance between them with an ease that left her flustered. She stumbled back instinctively, her legs brushing the edge of the bed, but Alexander only stopped a few feet away, his hands casually slipping into his pockets. "You're in no condition to leave, Sophia," he murmured, his voice low, almost teasing. "And besides, we have unfinished business, don't we?" Emily's pulse raced. She shook her head quickly, panic creeping up her spine. "I'm not Sophia," she blurted, her voice cracking. "I'm Emily, her twin." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Alexander's expression flickered surprise, skepticism, a flicker of something unreadable before settling back into cool detachment. "That's a new excuse," he murmured, tilting his head slightly, studying her like she was a puzzle he intended to solve. Emily's shoulders sagged as fresh tears stung her eyes. "Please," she whispered, "I didn't want any of this. Sophia asked me to cover for her, just for one night. I didn't know it would turn into this." She gestured weakly around the room, her voice trembling. "I just want to go home." For a long moment, Alexander said nothing. Then, to Emily's shock, he let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Of course she sent you," he murmured, almost to himself. "Why am I not surprised?" His gaze locked onto hers, sharp and intense. "Let me tell you something, Emily," he said softly. Your sister and I have a history, and none of it is innocent. You stepping into her place, even for a night, makes you part of this whether you like it or not." Emily's stomach twisted painfully, dread curling through her chest. She had walked blindly into a storm she couldn't escape. But as Alexander's eyes softened, just barely, as his hand reached out to gently brush a tear from her cheek, Emily felt her breath catch. There was something in his gaze that unsettled her, something that made her heart stutter in her chest. He wasn't just cold and dangerous, he was wounded too. And for reasons she couldn't yet understand, she was suddenly, terribly afraid of how much she wanted to understand him. Emily's chest rose and fell quickly, her heart hammering inside as Alexander's fingers brushed lightly against her cheek. She flinched, every nerve in her body on fire, but not with fear, with confusion, vulnerability, something dangerously close to anticipation. She squeezed her eyes shut, feeling the warmth of his hand vanish as he pulled back, stepping away with a sharp intake of breath, as though surprised by his own impulse. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured under his breath, but the words were more for himself than for her. Emily's eyes snapped open, watching him, her pulse still racing. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please just let me go." Alexander turned, his tall frame casting a shadow across the luxurious room, his face masked in cold control again. "It's not that simple," he said quietly, crossing his arms over his chest. "You walked into something much bigger than you realize." Emily felt her throat tighten painfully, tears threatening again. "I didn't mean to," she said desperately. "I never wanted this. My sister, she promised it was just one night." Alexander let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "Sophia always promises things she has no intention of keeping," he murmured, his jaw tightening. His eyes darkened, his gaze flicking to Emily, sharp as a knife. "Did she tell you why she sent you here?" Emily shook her head quickly, panic flickering in her chest. "No, she just said. She said you needed to see her, but she couldn't come. She begged me to stand in for her, just until she could sort something out." Alexander took a slow step forward, his presence looming again. Emily instinctively backed away, her bare feet brushing the edge of the plush carpet. She tightened the jacket around her shoulders, heart pounding wildly as she watched him approach. "She didn't tell you about the contract?" he asked softly, voice edged with something sharp and bitter. Emily blinked rapidly, confusion lacing her features. "What contract?" Alexander's lips curved into a cold, humorless smile. "She promised to marry me," he murmured. "It was part of a deal, one that would secure her a share of my company's media holdings." She agreed, signed the papers, smiled in all the photographs, played the part of the perfect fiancée. Until, of course, she decided she could get more by selling information to my competitors and running off before the wedding. Emily's stomach dropped, her head spinning. "No," she breathed. "She wouldn't." But even as she said it, she felt a terrible, sinking realization. Sophia had always been selfish, reckless, addicted to the thrill of risk and reward. She could have done this. She would have done this. Alexander's gaze softened slightly as he watched the truth settle into Emily's expression. "You really didn't know," he said quietly. Emily shook her head, fresh tears sliding down her cheeks. "I swear," she whispered, "I didn't know anything. She just told me to cover for her." Her voice cracked, her shoulders shaking as she hugged herself tightly. She felt small, foolish, humiliated, caught in a web she never meant to enter. To her shock, Alexander stepped forward and gently took her hand. Emily froze, her breath hitching as his fingers closed around hers, warm and firm. His eyes searched hers, a flicker of something unguarded passing through his expression. "I believe you," he murmured, his voice lower, softer. "But that doesn't change the fact that you're involved now, Emily," Emily trembled, her eyes wide as she stared up at him. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Alexander's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening. "I want you to stay here," he said quietly. "At least until this is over. Until I know you're safe." Emily's breath caught painfully in her chest. "Safe from what?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. Alexander let out a slow breath, his eyes darkening. "From your sister's enemies," he murmured. "And from mine." The days that followed passed in a tense, surreal blur. Emily stayed in the penthouse, watched closely by Alexander's discreet but ever-present security team. She wandered the luxurious rooms, feeling like a bird trapped in a gilded cage, her every movement shadowed by the weight of uncertainty and dread. Alexander came and went, his days consumed by tense meetings, urgent phone calls, whispered conversations behind closed doors. But every evening, without fail, he returned to her. They ate dinner together in the sleek, modern dining room, Emily sitting stiffly across from him, still wrapped in borrowed clothes, still feeling like an intruder in a world she didn't belong to. At first they barely spoke, the silence between them heavy and brittle, but slowly, over time, something began to shift. Alexander would glance at her with a flicker of softness in his eyes, asking about her life, her work, her dreams. Emily, cautious at first, found herself opening up, revealing pieces of herself she rarely shared with anyone. She told him about her childhood, about always living in Sophia's shadow, about the quiet, steady life she had built for herself, a life far away from glamour and danger. Alexander listened, his sharp, calculating gaze softening as she spoke. He told her about his own past, about losing his parents young, about building his empire. From nothing, about the betrayals that had shaped him into the cold, guarded man he was now. One night, as they sat together in the dimly lit study, Emily found herself laughing softly at something he had said. She caught the flicker of surprise in his expression, the way his lips curved into a rare, genuine smile. And in that moment, she felt something shift inside her, something she couldn't quite name, something that both terrified and exhilarated her. But even as they grew closer, the danger outside grew sharper. Alexander's competitors were closing in, the threat of betrayal looming larger every day. And Emily knew, deep in her heart, that when the final confrontation came, she would have to choose between running back to the quiet life she had known, or standing beside the man who had pulled her into a world of power, risk, and undeniable passion. Emily lay awake that night, curled beneath the soft sheets of the guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling as moonlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her heart ached with confusion, her mind spinning with the weight of everything she had learned. She could still feel Alexander's gaze on her from earlier, the way his voice had softened when he asked if she was sleeping well, the way his fingers had briefly, almost hesitantly, brushed hers when he handed her a glass of wine. She had never imagined she could feel this drawn to someone like him, someone so powerful, so cold, yet capable of such moments of unexpected tenderness. But every time she closed her eyes, the memory of Sophia's betrayal came rushing back. Her sister, who had always been wild but had always come home, had always smiled, had always pulled Emily close and whispered, "It's just us, kid, against the world." How could Sophia have sold her out like this, pushed her into danger without a second thought? Emily hugged herself, pressing her face into the pillow as a few silent tears slid down her cheeks. The next morning, Emily was startled awake by the sound of raised voices in the hallway. She hurried to the door, cracking it open just enough to see Alexander standing with two sharply dressed men, his jaw tight, his voice low but edged with steel. She couldn't hear the details, but the tension in the air was palpable, the kind that made her skin prickle. One of the men handed Alexander a folder, and Emily caught a glimpse of Sophia's name printed on the front before the door clicked shut. Her stomach twisted painfully. She knew she should stay back, let Alexander handle whatever storm was brewing, but a part of her was desperate for answers, desperate to understand how her life had been turned upside down overnight. She forced herself to wait until the men had left, until the penthouse had fallen quiet again, before cautiously stepping out of her room. She found Alexander in his office, his tall frame silhouetted against the window, his shoulders tense, one hand pressed to his temple as he stared at the papers on his desk. Emily hesitated in the doorway, unsure if she was intruding, but when his head turned slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto hers, her breath caught in her throat. "Come in," he murmured, his voice low, rougher than usual. She stepped forward, wringing her hands nervously. I heard voices," she said softly. "Is it about Sophia?" Alexander's jaw tightened, his fingers tapping once against the polished surface of his desk. "Yes," he said quietly. "She's back in the country. She's meeting with one of my competitors." His eyes flicked to hers, dark and unreadable. "She's trying to sell them information that could take down everything I've built." Emily's chest tightened painfully, her knees wobbling slightly. She reached blindly for the edge of the desk, her heart hammering. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. She couldn't." But even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her, sharp and bitter. She remembered all the times Sophia had lied, all the times she had smiled and said, "Trust me." Alexander's gaze softened slightly as he watched her. He rose from his chair, moving closer, his presence filling the room. "Emily," he murmured, his voice lower, gentler. "You don't have to defend her. Not anymore." Emily's breath hitched, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "She's my sister," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't just stop." Her words trailed off as Alexander reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin. For a long moment, they stood there, the tension between them electric, fragile. Emily felt her heart race wildly, felt the heat rise to her cheeks, felt the terrifying, exhilarating pull of something she had never dared want before. She didn't know who leaned in first, didn't know if it was his breath she felt on her lips or her own trembling need that closed the space between them. But when his mouth finally met hers, soft and tentative at first, then deeper, hungrier, the world tilted on its axis. Emily gasped softly, her fingers gripping the front of his shirt, her body pressed against his as the kiss deepened, as the cold, controlled billionaire she thought she knew melted away, revealing a man who kissed her like he had been starving for her, like he had been waiting for her without even knowing it. When they finally broke apart, breathless and shaken, Alexander's forehead rested lightly against hers, his eyes closed, his voice a rough whisper. "You're not her," he murmured. "You're nothing like her." Emily's heart ached in her chest, her fingers trembling as they touched his cheek. "I don't know what I'm doing here," she whispered. "I don't know how to survive this." Alexander's arms tightened around her, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to survive it alone," he murmured. "Not anymore." In the days that followed, the stakes rose higher. Alexander worked tirelessly to stay ahead of the threats closing in, while Emily struggled to reconcile her growing feelings for him with the fear and guilt gnawing at her heart. She caught glimpses of Sophia on the news, heard whispers of meetings, betrayals, dangerous alliances. She knew the final confrontation was coming, knew that soon everything would come crashing down. And still, in the quiet moments, in the stolen touches, in the whispered conversations late at night, she felt something bloom between them, fragile and fierce and impossible to deny. She had never expected to fall for a man like Alexander Drake, had never expected to find herself longing for the touch of a billionaire she had met under the worst possible circumstances. But now, as the shadows closed in, As the walls tightened around them, Emily knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, whatever storms they had to face, she didn't want to run anymore. She wanted to stand beside him. She wanted to fight for them. She wanted to choose him, even if it meant risking everything. That night, the rain lashed hard against the penthouse windows, the sound a constant whisper against the glass as Emily sat curled on the couch, watching Alexander from across the room. He had showered, cleaned the blood from his arm, changed into fresh clothes, but there was still a weariness in his eyes, a heaviness in his shoulders that she hadn't seen before. She watched as he poured himself a glass of dark whiskey, his fingers wrapping tightly around the crystal, his gaze fixed somewhere far away. Emily swallowed hard, her hands clenching in her lap. She wanted to speak, to ask him what he was thinking, but the words stuck in her throat. Finally, Alexander set down the glass and turned toward her, his sharp eyes softening slightly when they met hers. "Come here," he murmured, his voice low, almost a command. Emily felt her breath catch, her heart pounding as she rose slowly, crossing the room on unsteady feet. When she reached him, Alexander reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her cheek, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You've been brave through all of this," he said quietly. "More than I expected." Emily's chest tightened painfully. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered. Alexander's lips curved into a faint, bitter smile. "None of us do." Without thinking, Emily reached up, her fingers lightly touching his wrist, feeling the warmth of his skin. She didn't know why she did it, didn't know what she was searching for in that moment. But when Alexander's hand turned, his fingers curling around hers, something inside her gave way. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "For everything. For what Sophia did. For lying to you." For Alexander shook his head, cutting her off gently. "Stop," he murmured, his thumb brushing softly over her knuckles. "None of this is your fault." Emily felt tears sting her eyes, a knot tightening in her throat. She had spent her whole life apologizing, shrinking, hiding in Sophia's shadow. But here, now, with this man who had every reason to hate her, she felt seen in a way she never had before. She took a shaky breath, her eyes locking onto his. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked softly. Alexander let out a slow exhale, his gaze darkening. "Because," he murmured, "you're the first person who's looked at me without wanting something in return." The words hit her like a punch to the chest, raw and unexpected. Emily's fingers tightened on his hand, her heart racing wildly. She didn't know how they ended up so close, didn't know who moved first, but suddenly Alexander's arms were around her, pulling her gently but firmly against him, his warmth seeping into her as she buried her face against his shoulder. He held her like that for a long moment, his hand stroking slowly down her back, his breath warm against her hair. And when he finally pulled back, his eyes searching hers, Emily knew, without words, that something had shifted between them, something neither of them could deny. Alexander leaned down, his lips brushing softly against her forehead, a touch so light it sent shivers down her spine. "Get some rest," he murmured, his voice rough. "Tomorrow, we figure out what comes next." Emily nodded faintly, her cheeks flushed, her heart pounding so loud she was sure he could hear it. She let him guide her gently back to the couch, let him pull a blanket around her shoulders, let herself sink into the quiet warmth of the moment. She watched as he stepped away, pausing in the doorway to glance back at her one last time, his eyes dark and unreadable. And when he disappeared into the shadows, Emily closed her eyes, her fingers clutching the blanket tightly, her heart aching with something she didn't yet understand. That night, Emily dreamed of fire and ice, of sharp gray eyes and warm hands, of a man who had every reason to destroy her, but chose instead to save her. She woke before dawn, the city still shrouded in shadows, the penthouse eerily silent. She slipped quietly from the couch, padding softly through the darkened rooms, drawn to the faint light she saw under the study door. Pushing it open, she found Alexander there, seated at his desk, his head bowed over a stack of papers, the tension in his shoulders unmistakable. Emily hesitated in the doorway, unsure if she should disturb him, but Alexander looked up, his sharp eyes softening slightly when they met hers. "Couldn't sleep," he murmured. Emily shook her head, stepping tentatively into the room. She hesitated, then asked softly, "You?" Alexander let out a faint, humorless laugh, rubbing a hand through his dark hair. "Sleep, and I have never been good friends," he murmured. Emily crossed the room slowly, stopping just beside his chair. She hesitated, then reached out, her fingers lightly brushing his shoulder. "You should rest," she whispered. Alexander's hand caught hers, his fingers curling tightly around hers, holding her there. For a long moment, they simply sat like that, the world shrinking to the quiet space between them, the unspoken weight of everything they had been through hanging heavy in the air. And when Alexander finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost vulnerable. "I don't know what happens next, Emily," he murmured. "I only know that I don't want to face it alone." Emily's breath hitched, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She squeezed his hand tightly, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Then don't." And in that quiet moment, in the stillness before the storm, they found something neither of them had expected. A fragile, undeniable connection. A flicker of light in the darkness, a promise that maybe, just maybe, they could weather whatever came next together. Morning light streamed softly through the tall windows, casting delicate golden patterns across the marble floors. Emily sat on the edge of the couch, knees pulled close to her chest, feeling the soft brush of the silk robe Alexander's staff had given her. She was awake, but her mind spun in quiet circles, replaying the moments of the night before, the weight of his words, the feel of his hand holding hers. She had come here only by accident, drawn into a world not meant for her, but now she was no longer sure she could walk away even if given the chance. Across the room, Alexander stood by the window, dressed in another impeccably tailored suit, his back to her as he spoke quietly. On the phone. His voice was low, controlled, laced with authority. Emily watched the rigid set of his shoulders, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his fingers clenched slightly around the phone. He was the kind of man who commanded entire boardrooms, who negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking. But in these quiet, stolen moments, she saw the shadow of the man underneath someone weighed down by burdens, someone used to standing alone. When he hung up, Alexander turned, his sharp gaze softening slightly when it landed on her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice gentle in a way that made her chest tighten. Emily managed a faint smile, though her fingers trembled slightly as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Better," she whispered, her voice still rough with the lingering weight of everything that had happened. He crossed the room slowly, each step measured, controlled, until he stood just in front of her. Without a word, he reached out, brushing his knuckles lightly along her cheek, a touch so fleeting it left her breathless. "There's something you need to know," Alexander murmured, his expression darkening. Emily's heart jumped in her chest. She shifted, her hands clutching the edge of the cushion as she stared up at him. "What is it?" she asked softly. Alexander exhaled slowly, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. "Sophia wasn't just running from me," he said quietly. "She was running from someone else, someone dangerous." Emily's blood ran cold. "Who?" she breathed. Alexander's jaw tightened. "A man named Vincent Lane," he murmured, One of my oldest rivals. He's been after my company for years, and Sophia, she made a deal with him. Emily felt her stomach twist, a sickening dread curling through her chest. What kind of deal? She whispered. Alexander's eyes darkened, his expression grim. She gave him insider information, he said quietly, in exchange for money, protection. I don't know all the details yet, but it's bad, Emily. And now, because you stepped into her place, you're part of it. Emily's breath hitched, her pulse racing wildly. What do we do? She asked, her voice shaking. Alexander's gaze softened slightly, his hand lifting to brush gently against her cheek again. We face it, he murmured. Together. The day passed in a tense blur, Alexander on constant calls, his security team moving in and out of the penthouse, quiet but efficient. Emily stayed mostly out of the way, pacing the living room, her nerves fraying with each passing hour. She hated feeling useless, hated the gnawing fear that sat heavy in her chest, but more than anything, she hated the thought of Alexander standing alone against this storm. That night, Alexander found her curled up on the couch, staring out at the city lights. He sat beside her quietly, the distance between them closing until she could feel the warmth of his presence. I need to leave for a few hours, he said softly. Emily's head snapped up, panic flickering in her eyes. No, she whispered, reaching out to clutch his arm. Please, don't go. Alexander's lips curved faintly, a ghost of a smile touching his face. I'll be okay, he murmured, his fingers brushing lightly along hers. But I need you to stay here, where it's safe. Emily's heart ached painfully, her throat tightening. She wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him she couldn't bear the thought of something happening to him, but the words caught in her chest. Instead, she nodded faintly, her fingers slipping reluctantly from his arm. Alexander leaned in, pressing a soft, fleeting kiss to her forehead. I'll be back before you know it, he murmured, his voice low and warm. Wait for me. Hours later, Emily sat alone in the darkened penthouse, the silence pressing heavily around her. She hugged her knees to her chest, her mind spinning with worry, fear, longing. Every sound made her jump, every shadow sent her heart racing. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. And when the door finally swung open and Alexander stepped inside, his suit rumpled, his face pale but determined, she let out a shaky breath of relief, tears stinging her eyes. Without a word, Emily rushed forward, throwing her arms around him, clinging tightly, as if she could anchor herself to him, keep him safe. Alexander's arms wrapped around her instantly, holding her close, his breath warm against her hair. I'm here, he murmured softly. I'm okay. Emily pulled back slightly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You're sure? She whispered. Alexander's lips curved faintly, his fingers brushing gently along her jaw. I'm sure, he murmured. And when he leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a soft, lingering kiss, Emily felt her heart stutter, her knees weaken, her entire world narrow to the feel of his mouth on hers, the warmth of his body against hers. That night, as they sat together in the quiet, as Alexander rested his forehead gently against hers, as his hand closed tightly around hers, Emily knew that no matter what came next, no matter how dark or dangerous the road ahead, they would face it together. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was living in someone else's shadow. For the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be, in the arms of the man who had become her unexpected salvation. Days passed, and the storm that had hovered on the edge of their lives finally broke. Vincent Lane was arrested after Alexander's team uncovered the full extent of the scheme Sophia had been part of. The media erupted with headlines, scandals, and endless stories, but through it all, Alexander kept Emily safely shielded behind the doors of his penthouse. She watched the chaos unfold from the safety of his world, feeling like she had been dropped into a movie she was never meant to star in. On a quiet evening, as the last of the legal calls wrapped up and the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily stood on the penthouse balcony, the soft breeze tugging at her hair. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the glittering skyline, her heart full and heavy all at once. So much had changed. So fast. She thought of Sophia, now facing the consequences of her choices. She thought of herself, the girl who had stepped into her sister's shoes for one night and ended up rewriting her entire life. And she thought of Alexander, the man who had walked beside her through every moment, fierce and gentle, guarded and vulnerable, all at once. She heard the soft click of the balcony door and turned to see Alexander stepping out. His sharp suit traded for something more relaxed, his eyes softer in the fading light. He crossed to her slowly, his hand sliding gently around her waist as he pulled her close. "You're quiet tonight," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Emily let out a soft breath, resting her head against his chest. "Just thinking," she whispered. Alexander's arms tightened slightly around her. "About leaving?" he asked quietly. Emily smiled faintly, shaking her head. "About staying," she whispered back. She felt his chest rise and fall with a quiet breath, his fingers brushing lightly along her back. "I don't want you to feel trapped here," he murmured. Emily lifted her head, her eyes locking onto his, clear and steady. "I don't," she said softly. "I feel safe here. I feel wanted here. I feel like, for the first time in my life, I'm not just standing in someone else's shadow." Alexander's gaze softened, something raw flickering in his eyes. He reached up, cupping her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing softly along her cheeks. "You were never just a shadow, Emily," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "You were always the light. I just had to open my eyes to see it." Tears pricked Emily's eyes, her heart swelling painfully in her chest. She rose onto her toes, pressing her lips softly to his, and when Alexander wrapped his arms tightly around her, kissing her back with a tenderness that stole her breath away, she knew she had found something she never expected. Not just love, but a partner, a place, a purpose. As the night deepened around them, as the stars began to glitter high above the city, Emily leaned into Alexander's arms, feeling his warmth, his strength, his quiet promise wrapped around her like a shield. She had started this journey as a girl caught in a sister's reckless game, but she had come out the other side as a woman who had learned to fight, to trust, to love. And as Alexander whispered softly against her ear, a vow of forever, a promise of tomorrow, Emily smiled through her tears, knowing that for once her story was no longer just about surviving. It was about living. It was about them. And together, they would build something beautiful from the shadows they had left behind.